So the traditional employment interview as a concept is a little bit strange. Okay, I think we can all sort of agree about that when we think about it. You just sit down and you talk to someone, and somehow you can crystal ball that into performance prediction and to determine whether you think this would be a good employee. That is weird when you say it out loud, and it's weird in practice. Now, empirically, for some reason, it can work. Especially if you use structured interviews, it can work. But you must understand, and organizations really need to understand, how unreliable and how often how unfair interviews are. Now, people are increasingly turning away from automation and AI. People are kind of sort of reactively going, okay, we want a sort of person or human-centric approach to hiring. That sounds nice, but what that means is I'm scared of automation and I want to do what feels comfortable. That's often what that means. Now, the issue I have with interviews is they get shoehorned in, and a century of evidence showing how unfair they can be is just ignored. Whereas everything else that might be added shown incredible skepticism, and the evidence required is just so high by comparison. Now, a really interesting study came out, a big meta-analysis looking at accent bias in interviews. Okay, what that means is people who have what they call non-standard accents, people who aren't speaking the prestige variant of that language, what kind of bias they can expect, how low they perform on interviews relative to a standard accent. Think received pronunciation versus Welsh or Scouse or something like that, or sort of general American versus sort of Appalachian American, something like that. What they found was genuinely shocking, in that the effect size, the adverse impact caused only by one's accent was just under about 0.5 in terms of the standardized effect size. Even worse is that there are a range of moderator variables, the biggest one being gender, in that women who have non-standard accents were substantially less likely to receive higher ratings on interview performance. Seems to be an intersectional thing. More than that, depending on the type of accent, what the writers consider to be racial or ethnic accents saw even lower performance. Okay? Which means, of course, if you are a woman and you have a sort of racial or ethnic accent, then we're looking at triple jeopardy. Even lower. Even more bizarrely, when the interviewer was a woman, the effect seems to be even greater, with men showing less accent bias than women. And so now we're piecing this together, all of these variables, which seem to suggest actually interviews are really unstandardized, and performance is really variable, depending on completely irrelevant characteristics. Your accent has no indication of how well you're going to perform in the workplace. It is so trivial, and yet it has this huge implication. If all of these factors align, then what you have is someone who is likely very competent scoring substantially lower on interviews than they would deserve, purely because of how they sound, and because of their gender, and because of the gender of the particular interviewer. These are things that are irrelevant, or should be irrelevant to performance. It highlights how not objective and how unfair interviews can be. Now, what you do about this, of course, and what I always recommend, is interviews should just be at the end of the process as a final check. Okay? People use interviews as a screening tool, which is completely incorrect in my opinion. Okay? It's not cost effective to do that. You can't interview dozens of people. That's not a useful use of anyone's time. They should just be a final checklist just to make sure they are the person who they say they are, and they have some of the skills that they've purported to have. Okay? Assessments generally are a much better way of doing this early on. They're scalable, they're efficient, it's a fraction of the cost when it comes to comparing a full-on interview. And you can actually investigate these for bias so much more easily because they're standardized products. Okay, it is so much fairer than an interview by a country mile. And yet people have the exact opposite opinions. They think interviews are just the gold standard, and anything that's an interview, you'd be really skeptical of. It is very much the opposite. Interviews are so vulnerable to bias. It's literally just the opinion of the person talking to them. Literally just one set of characteristics. Okay, huge potential for bias. And then you think of all the other characteristics that could lead to unconscious bias. As well, not just accent and gender, but you think about age. Think about language, let alone accent, language. Think about sexual orientation. Think about disability status. There's so many variables that will inevitably influence a person's opinion during an interview. Okay, and you cannot train this out. Okay, implicit bias training does not work empirically. Just not an effective tool. But everyone has these biases, and they are pervasive and they are harmful, and you insulate against them by using assessments.